Hi, everybody. I'm Alfred Schipke, the director of the East Asian Institute, and I teach at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. It's a great pleasure to welcome NUS colleagues from other universities, private and financial sector experts, the diplomatic community, both here at the Institute and, of course, online. Today's seminar on the regional economic outlook for Asia and the Pacific is open to the public and media and will be recorded. So this is an on-the-record session. Anything that you say can and will be held against you. So, but with that, I'm also very pleased to welcome Krishna Srinivasan and my former IMF colleagues here. Krishna will present the regional economic outlook for Asia and the Pacific. He's the director of the Asia and Pacific Department, where he oversees the IMF's work on the region. He's had a long and distinguished career at the fund and been in many different departments, including the Western Hemisphere Department, but he was also the mission chief for the United Kingdom and for Israel and led the IMF's work on G20 issues in the context of the global financial crisis. He received his PhD in international finance from Indiana University and a master's from the Delhi School of Economics in India. Krishna, we're very much looking forward to first listening to your presentation, followed by a discussion afterward. For those who are online, you have two options. You can either put your questions into a chat. My colleague, Qidong Pao, is monitoring those and will pick them up, or you can raise your hand at the end. But with that, Krishna, we're very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Alfred. So this was a report which was released today. It's the outlook for Asia Pacific. Let me start with the summary here. In the second half of 2023, many Asian economies outperformed previous forecasts. So strong domestic demand was the main driver. External demand picked up for only a few economies. I'll talk about that in a second. Second, we project growth to slow into 2024 and 2025, but less rapidly than we had in our October of last year forecast. But even with slower growth, Asia and Pacific would contribute 60% of global growth. Third, disinflation has advanced throughout the region, although at different speeds, from slow disinflation all the way to risks of deflation. Fourth, risks are now more balanced than they were only a few months ago. A slowdown in China and geoeconomic fragmentation are two of the most prominent downside risks. And finally, in terms of policies, monetary policy should focus on bringing inflation to target. Fiscal consolidation should accelerate in most countries, given high debt levels and the erosion of buffers. So let me start with the emerging Asia surprise on the upside slide. So basically what we see is in most Asian countries, growth surprised on the upside in the second half of 2023. It reached 5% for the year as a whole. This is much stronger than the outcome in 2022, which was 3.9%, and also about 0.4 percentage points higher than we had forecast earlier. Now, positive growth surprises were concentrated in emerging Asia, including in Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and most notably in India. By contrast, in most advanced economies in the region, growth outcomes were close to the October projections we had in our last year. And as a right-hand side chart shows, the composition of growth differed between country groups. In most emerging markets, private consumption was a key driver. In India, it was basically capex which contributed to growth. And in advanced economies, growth was mostly driven by net exports. So again, there's heterogeneity in terms of the surprises and in terms of the contributions to GDP growth. Now, external demand has remained pretty much lackluster. As you see on the left-hand side chart, import demand from Asia's major trading partners stagnated or actually contracted. Technology products from advanced Asia have been a key exception. Exports picked up markedly in the second half of 2023, and this sector may benefit from a surge in demand for high-end semiconductors related to AI applications. So again, very few countries benefited from the pickup in demand. This includes Korea, Singapore, and a few others. Now, data from China has been mixed. Let me also say that our forecasts here were baked before the Q1 GDP came out for China, which was much better than we had forecasted. Now, that said, the GDP in Q1 surprised the upside, and March PMIs for services and manufacturing had their very strong readings in several months. However, on the property sector side, where you had the problem has been lingering for some time, both the property sector and consumer confidence remain subdued. Stock market valuations have contracted, especially for real estate firms. So you have mixed data, but I would say on balance, given how Q1 GDP came out, there are upside risks to our growth forecast. Turning to inflation, it's important to note that in Asia, price pressures peaked at only around half the level seen elsewhere. So inflation started rising across the board in all countries in 2020, but in Asia, it peaked at almost half the level what we saw in other parts of the world. And then in 2023, headline inflation fell sharply, especially in emerging Asia. And a sharp drop in commodity prices helped, but core inflation also retreated as goods price inflation fell and supply bottlenecks triggered as the pandemic abated. Now, services price inflation has remained sticky. As a result, core inflation in advanced economies is still elevated. Advanced economies of Asia still elevated, as their services account for a large share in the consumption basket. So again, in inflation, there's a mixed picture, differing between emerging Asia and advanced Asia. And financial conditions have eased. The expectation of lower policy rates triggered a global search for yield. This has in turn compressed sovereign yields, especially for frontier markets such as Mongolia and Papua New Guinea. In the case of Papua New Guinea, as you know, we have an IMF program there. And overall, the region has continued to benefit from steady portfolio inflows, with the exception of China. So China, you've seen outflows, but other parts of Asia, portfolio flows have been rising steadily. So this is our forecast. I don't think I'm going to spend too much time on this, but if I could just highlight a few countries here. So growth in Japan, we have it at slowing down from 1.9% to around potential of 0.9%. In 2023, you had one-off factors such as pickup in tourism and so on, which have abated. And so for going forward for 2025, we have marked up growth. And that's partly because we expect robust wage settlements following the Shinto wage negotiations. In Korea and Singapore, we project growth to increase to more than 2%. Again, Korea Q1 GDP came out just 2 days ago, which was again better than expected. So both Korea and China, we are likely to revise up our forecast in due course. And how does it show up for emerging markets? In China, growth is projected to slow modestly to 4.6% in 2024. Again, this is before we got the Q1 GDP. And India and the Philippines have been sources of repeated positive growth surprises. For 2024, we have marked up growth forecast in India to 6.8% and in the Philippines to 6.2%. India remains the fastest growing major economy in the world. And if you look at ASEAN economies, the prospects are kind of heterogeneous. In Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam, we expect robust growth, but the outlook for Thailand seems much more subdued. So that's as far as the growth forecasts are concerned. We can talk about that when we have our discussion after the presentation. So what will drive growth in 2024 and 2025? So as the chart on the left-hand side shows, the external environment is gradually improving. We have marked up growth projections for both the US and China. Still, we expect Asian exports to benefit only moderately, as global demand has shifted from traded goods to domestic produced services, which means that much less demand from Asian goods exports. So this means that domestic demand will remain the engine of growth in Asia, but the composition differs. In China and India, investment is projected to contribute disproportionately to growth, like similar to what we had in 2023. And emerging Asia outside China and India, private consumption will remain the key driver. And in advanced economies, net exports will support growth, but we also expect some strengthening of private consumption. What about inflation? Again, inflation, in our report, we identified 3 sets of countries. In one group, which consists of Australia, New Zealand, and to a lesser extent, Korea, inflation is still above target, reflecting in part sustained pressure from services. The second group, we have most emerging markets and Japan, where headline inflation has returned close to central bank targets and core inflation is contained. And finally, in China and Thailand, we have falling commodity prices and some slack, pushing headline inflation into negative territory for some time. Core inflation is positive but low. Again, in China, we don't have deflation per se in the baseline. We have inflation low, which is about 0.8 to 1%. So call it more like low inflation rather than deflation. So in this chart, on the right-hand side, you can see that China and Thailand have negative output gaps and core inflation below target. They are in the bottom left-hand quadrant. Australia and New Zealand have positive output gaps and above target inflation. They are in the top right-hand quadrant. The others are somewhere in between. And so what we project is that somewhere everywhere in Asia, in most parts of Asia, I would say, inflation is projected to converge towards central bank targets, both from up and down, from above and below. Of course, the forecast is conditional on implementation of adequate macroeconomic policies. In economies where inflation is still materially above central bank targets, tight monetary and fiscal policies are expected to support disinflation, which would also bring output more towards potential. By contrast, in countries with negative output gaps, a more accommodative policy stance would support demand and push inflation back into positive territory. How much time do I have? Okay. Now, let me talk a little bit about risks to the outlook. And here we focus on a few risks. The first, of course, is China. Now, the real estate sector has remained under pressure for some time, and we haven't seen anything getting better. Even in the first quarter, when GDP numbers came out better, PMIs came out better, the pressures on the real estate sector have continued. So both real estate investment and housing starts have been pretty dismal. Concerns around inflation became stronger after headline CPI declined between October of last year and January of this year. So inflation was negative from October of this year to January, October of last year to January of this year. It kind of reversed in February, but again, it's partly related to the Lunar New Year. So the question is, how do we see inflation going forward? We in our baseline, we have inflation about 0.8%. Again, low, but not deflation. Core inflation has been consistently positive in China, but low. And whatever happens in China has important bearing on the rest of the region, and I'll get back to that in a minute. The other risk we talk about, which is more like short to medium term, is fragmentation. Now, restrictions on trade and on cross-border movements of capital and technology are a key risk for Asia Pacific, given the region's deep integration in global value chains. And we see new trade restrictions being imposed at a rapid pace, both in the region and globally. So here on the left-hand side chart, you can see that restrictions have been rising across all regions of the world. And one consequence is shown in the chart on the right. American imports from China have fallen since 2017, as one might expect, given the surge in bilateral trade restrictions, right? However, at the same time, value-added import by the United States from China still increased. This suggests that goods produced from China have been rerouted through countries like Vietnam and Mexico, where we've seen the opposite phenomena. Exports of goods to the US have grown much faster than exports of value added. So, in other words, the fragmentation is taking the form of supply chains becoming longer. You see goods going from China, the US, through various other countries. And this points to rising inefficiency and a lengthening of supply chains, not really benefiting the consumer at large. Now, global tensions may disrupt trade. As we all are aware, attacks on cargo ships in the Red Sea have forced a rerouting of vessels within Asia and Europe, driving up consumer prices. So that could be another disruption. And this impact is particularly acute for the Pacific Island countries, which are both heavily import dependent and poorly connected to global shipping networks. So while Asia is going to be hurt by what's happening, the tensions, some countries in particular, the PICs in particular, are going to be are likely to be more affected. So that's the other risk which we talk about in the report. And then, of course, US financial conditions could be tighter than envisaged. I mean, strong recent data have pushed up US yields, and markets have become more bearish about interest rate cuts by the Federal Reserve. Now, the current constellation, where policy rates in Asia are very low relative to those in the US, may hence persist for longer than markets anticipated just a few weeks ago, or a few weeks ago, right? Now, staff analysis shows that US interest rate shocks have a strong and immediate impact on borrowing costs and on exchange rates in Asia. In particular, if the federal funds rate were to stay higher for longer, this could provoke capital outflows and trigger depreciation pressures for Asian currency. You've already started seeing that, and that could intensify. What does all this mean for policies? Here, we again talk about the fact that the appropriate policy stance depends on where inflation is relative to target. In economies where core inflation remains elevated, a tighter for longer policy stance may be needed. Here I'm talking about countries like Australia, New Zealand, and to a smaller extent, Korea. Where inflation is already at or close to target and inflation expectations are stable, monetary policy may be able to ease later in the year. And finally, in economies where inflation is uncontrollably low, maintaining or moving to a less restrictive stance is called for to avoid these deflationary expectations taking hold. So market implied real rates are broadly consistent with these objectives: positive for overheating economies and almost zero for countries facing deflationary pressures. And one thing which we recommend in the report, we recommend that Asian central banks focus on domestic inflation and avoid making their policy decisions overly dependent on what the Fed does. If central banks follow the Fed too closely, this could undermine price stability in their own countries. What does it mean for fiscal? What we have seen is that we have seen a rise in public debt, and we're calling for building of fiscal buffers. And in 2023, what we saw was consolidation in this region fell well short of what we had projected. Right? So going forward, the good news is that the fiscal adjustment incorporated in our projections would stabilize debt to GDP at the levels they are right now. However, that's still on a very high side. So what we are advocating is that it's important for countries to embark on more ambitious fiscal adjustment and to reduce debt levels and contain debt service costs. You will need expenditure rationalization and especially revenue mobilization, and that would eventually free up space for safety nets, climate mitigation, so on. This is the one region where revenue mobilization is particularly low, and it came to the fore in some of the countries where we've had crises like Sri Lanka and other places where you saw that part of the problem stemmed from revenues being very, very low. And it's not just the program countries, but broadly across countries in the region, revenues are low. So when you talk about fiscal consolidation, we are calling more for revenue-based consolidation rather than expenditure rationalization so much. Turning to the longer term, the region faces significant structural challenges. I'll touch upon two issues briefly. First, new technologies such as artificial intelligence may bring both significant growth opportunities and economic and social challenges. Staff analysis suggests that Asian emerging markets are somewhat better prepared for such challenges than their peers around the world. This is not necessarily true for Asia's advanced economies, but where you've seen more of digitalization, you see that thing playing a bigger factor. Second, population aging will advance rapidly in many economies in the region. Aging populations exert downward pressure on growth potential and may stretch social security systems. This is particularly acute for countries like China, where we see both productivity declining over the medium term and population aging. So for countries like China, it would be even more imperative to addressing these challenges. So while the policy response needs to be tailored to country circumstances, it's common to invest in common prescriptions, invest in capital, digital infrastructure, and workforce skills in order to preserve Asia's role as a global engine of growth. Again, Do I go into these things? Maybe not. In the interest of time, maybe I should stop. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So first, there are spillovers from China to the region. If China would experience a deeper downturn and deflation pressures, this would impact the region through several channels. One is through falling export prices for Chinese goods, which would put pressure on the profit margins of China's competitors. In fact, we have done some analysis in the report, which suggests that falling renminbi prices reduce both export prices and export volumes of neighboring countries. And the impact is largest for countries that produce similar goods to China, such as Vietnam or Korea. But there is an upside. Robust policy support in China can be good news for the region. For this, not only the amount, but also the nature of policy support matters. Measures that address stresses in China's property sector can go a long way in restoring consumer confidence and boosting domestic demand. By contrast, policies that strengthen China's supply capacity would reinforce deflationary pressures and could provoke frictions. And my last slide, corporate sector risks. I mean, corporate debt metrics in Asia look by and large pretty good. However, the monetary tightening of the last 2 years is not yet fully reflected in firms' balance sheets. Specifically, the impact on debt service costs has until today been partly offset by higher interest earnings on firms' short-term assets. I mean, our analysis shows that net interest costs are likely to peak with a delay of 2 or 3 years. So financial supervisors should be vigilant and monitor closely the buildup of risks. So these are the two things. Our spring regional economic outlook is usually a much more, it's a shorter version of our report. The one in September will have much more of analytical work focusing on things like aging, AI, climate change, and so on. So this is a summary of our report. Alfred, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Krishna. I already saw that for a great presentation. I think it will lead to very interesting discussions. There was one question posted online about the presentation and the underlying report. Both of them you will be able to find on the IMF webpage. So please go to the IMF page for more information. Again, as I indicated, we'll have 2 parts. We have, of course, people here in the audience that will ask questions, and then Dong Tao will take questions from the floor. But maybe I'll start out with 1 or 2 questions. To be a little bit provocative, I think one of the key messages of the report is that Asia and the Pacific matter. As a matter of fact, they are the main contributor to global growth. I would even go 1 step further. If you combine India and China alone, that's 50% or about 50% to global growth. And if you compare that to the revisions you did to the October projections, the large change actually comes from the revision both for India and China. What that ultimately means, shocks, both in the positive or negative side, would have humongous implications for the regions and globally. But maybe I could follow up with 1 question. I think that is on everybody's mind and that you highlighted on as well. And maybe I focus a little bit more on China. And that is this issue about exchange rate monetary policy. There are quite a number of analysts in the region that are a little bit concerned that China's exchange rate or the central bank is actually focusing a little bit too much on the stability vis-a-vis the US dollar. At the same time, people are arguing, given where China is in terms of its economic cycle, maybe additional policy support is needed, and that might include a little bit of monetary policy as well. Now, that ultimately then can lead to the conundrum that you also highlighted, that if there were to be a sharp adjustment of the RMB vis-a-vis the US dollar, that could have adverse implications for the region and exports of other countries in the region, and ultimately could also, and we know that we're in the almost pre-political cycle in the United States, make things more complicated with the United States. So a little bit of, what your advice is in terms of, encouraging China continue to be more flexible on the exchange rate side, maybe, and this is, a question, to be more accommodative on the monetary policy side, but how does it square with the exchange rate? Maybe I'll start here.
So on China question, do you want to take that, Thomas? So Thomas oversees the work on China, and so he might be able to add a little bit more color to the discussion here. Thomas.
With this both sort of a national or a China-specific dimension, and then also the regional dimension. Let me start with the China dimension. Here, if you look at our most recent staff report, which was released in February this year, we make two points regarding macroeconomic policy. The argument basically, China has experienced a large negative shock, the real estate correction, let me call it as that. The triggers you could debate, you can debate to what extent it was policy induced, reflected other factors, but as a matter of fact, the economy has experienced a large shock. If you just, in terms of the impact, if you look at the real estate sector, its size, and the downstream industries linked to the sector, you get that just the reduction in residential investment, the cumulative sort of annual reduction in residential investment, plus the downstream impact amounts to about 2 percentage points GDP. Right? I mean, so that's a very, very large impact. So China, as a result, has excess capacity or a negative output gap. And one result of this constellation is that everything else, you have downward price pressures. And interestingly, what you see in China, including in the most recent GDP release, you have real growth stronger than nominal growth, which in an economy with considerable leverage at different level in different sectors, if you start with local governments, if you even look at households, if you look at the corporate sector, low nominal growth is an issue, just because earnings do not necessarily rise commensurately with the interest burden. So in fact, in the staff report, we call for more exchange rate flexibility, assuming that under normal circumstances, it would mean more depreciation. At the same time, we also call for more monetary easing. We say weak domestic demand, the economy operating potential, there's makes good sense to support demand. So I think there, the argument is easy. With concerns about potential for debt deflation or an increasing real debt burden, we think a little bit of help from the exchange rate would help, not just for expenditure switching, but also to lift inflation and therefore for prices and alleviate the problem. So that's the China side to the story. The regional side, and I may point you to the publication online of the Regional Economic Outlook. We actually have a box on the issue of regional implications. This is the box looks at past evidence on shocks to the renminbi and its impact on Asian currencies. And we compared that to the regional impact of shocks to the yen and what it means for other currencies in the region. As you can suspect, with limited exchange rate fluctuation of the yuan or renminbi against the dollar, the empirical evidence suggests that there's not a strong, usually not a strong impact of shocks to the renminbi on currencies in Asia. Whereas if you look at shocks to the yen, typically that has a sizable impact on currencies in the region. For details, you may want to consult the box, which is available online. Now, in the current situation, we're sort of looking at the situation where if there were more renminbi flexibility on renminbi depreciation, that clearly would probably exert pressures on currencies in the region. Now, to how big that, how severe that will be, how markets will play out is open. Because at the moment, what we have seen over the past year is initially, when the real estate shock hit the Chinese economy, the renminbi depreciated from a level of about 6.2 against the dollar to something just above 7. And that was in line at the time when Asian currencies were also under pressure because of monetary policy divergence. So the yen, the Korean won, most ASEAN countries' currencies also depreciated. So in that sense, it was mostly a common shock, plus perhaps a China-specific shock driving the yen in addition. So right now, if the renminbi were to depreciate, it would be against much stronger depreciation of other currencies. But based just on theory, and I think theories and empirical evidence on exchange rate behavior, I think it would be the case that naturally currencies in Asia will come under additional pressure if the renminbi were to devalue. But as such, if that's the natural adjustment of exchange rates, it could maybe mean that policies have to adjust if there were larger pass-through to the region. But I think it's just a natural adjustment of the exchange rates, and the global economy would have to live it. As for China, then finally, as political tensions, I think we would argue, I think it's normal that the exchange rate plays a role in the economic adjustment to shocks. But in a large economy, then you also about the policy mix and whether there's enough demand support in China. And there we have argued, no, there should be more.
Thank you very much. Can you just briefly say who you are?
I'm Bernard Yang. Previously at the business school, still retired from there, and at EAI. I would like to ask the following question. Before that, I want to thank you for a very balanced, a very poised report. My questions are the following, as related to China. Do you have any information and expectations on the central government's management of the local fiscal deficit in debt? Number two, you just announced about bringing the capital market, high quality capital market. Do you have any expectations or any information on what the movement would be, what the moves would be? And finally, do you know of anything that they plan to do to boost the consumers' confidence?
I'll take the third one, and then the first two comments. See, on the consumer confidence, you've seen that ever since the property crisis started, confidence has plummeted. So one thing which we have argued repeatedly is that China needs to fix the problem in the property sector. And we've been quite clear about what needs to be done. This problem has lingered for some time. And they have put in place some policy measures like, lowering the mortgage interest rates, allowing people to buy property, but with lower down payments and so on, and also reduce interest rates. It hasn't really helped together, right? All this put together. So what we're saying is three things. One, of course, is you need to triage the developers. You need to make sure that the bad ones, when I say bad ones with the balance sheets which are more distressed, are separated ones from the ones which are better balance sheets. And I think that's really needed, important, and because that's why contagion started and it's intensified. So you need to do that. We've also advocated the fact that central government should step in and provide about 5% of GDP in terms of support to the sector to finish the prepaid houses, so that'll help building confidence and allowing prices to adjust. So these are three things which we've talked about in terms of boosting confidence in the sector, and hopefully that will also boost consumption demand. As Thomas indicated, demand is very sluggish. Domestic demand is very sluggish. This could help address part of that. The other issue, of course, is we've talked about rebalancing for a very long time in terms of having greater contribution of consumption to growth. There we talked about improving social safety nets in China so that would reduce precautionary savings and help boost consumption. That has found very little traction so far. So these are things which we talk about in terms of boosting first confidence and consumption demand. And Thomas, we'll get to the other two questions, local government debt.
So on local government debt,
and fiscal deficit.
And fiscal deficit. So where should I start? It's a big question. So let me maybe first just to the point. I think the central government has tried to rein in local government finance for some time. There have been various attempts of that, I would say, over the past 10 to 12 years. At the origin of a problem is a vertical fiscal imbalance where the expenditure mandate of local governments is beyond their revenue capacity, what they get in the current revenue sharing agreement. And the issue has been that local governments have basically looked to address this imbalance through issuing off-balance sheet debt. And that issue has been recognized. I'm not sure about the entire history, but what I know from our work, at least, there was an audit report back in 2014 that recognized the off-balance sheet debt, and the central government has issued various guidelines trying to rein in the problem. So far, these attempts have not been that successful because if one avenue was closed, then other avenues were found, essentially. Now, with point number two, with the real estate correction, that problem has come to the fore because a lot of that off-budget debt or financing, which then also translated into augmented local government deficits, came to a halt because basically a lot of that off-balance sheet finance was ultimately land-based, be either indirectly through revenue from land use right sales, or otherwise it was collateral for other borrowing in the market. With the sharp decline in revenue from land use right sales, so the whole system fell apart. The government is trying to rein in, has made a renewed attempt to rein in local government debt finance, and has certainly is at the moment, as far as we know, taking stock and cataloging all that off-balance sheet debt across all provinces. There are about 12 provinces at the moment which have severe financial stress, and there the local government has intervened, try through various means to relieve their debt finance strains, basically enabling them to repay debt plus interest and to meet expenditure mandates. There have been some transfer of general government resources to these troubled provinces, plus some attempts at restructuring the debt in the sense of allowing the provinces to issue on balance sheet or regular local government bonds and then repay some of the off-budget bonds. In exchange, though, the governments these local governments were then obliged to reduce expenditure, to get approval for investment plans, and have to rein in deficits. But so far, the reining in has been most directly for the 12 most affected provinces, whereas other provinces have had no general government support of this kind, as far as we know. Although they, in anticipation of further government intervention, have already started to some extent to rein in expenditure. But at the aggregate level, we have so far not seen sort of something what one could call a fiscal cliff, where local governments overall have sharply reduced their expenditure. So overall, we still think that the aggregate fiscal stance is about neutral at the moment.
And I would point you to our staff report of last year, which dealt with this issue quite in depth in terms of the linkages between the property sector and local government provinces. What does it mean for the fiscal? So I would refer you to that. And in the forthcoming Article 4, we actually go deeper into the institutional frameworks of the session.
We also have a selected issues paper, which sort of draws out the linkages.
Very good. Srini, Sarah, yeah, left or right, who came first? We'll go here and then over there, and then we'll go online, yeah?
So thanks for a great presentation. One question on India and one on China. You've mentioned seems to be the consensus, India is the largest, fastest growing major economy, etc. But you've also mentioned, it's investment led and public investment. So the question there is, and it's also, the corporate sector has been deleveraging in India for a long time. So despite having low levels of leverage, there is low private investment. So how long do you think this could be sustained, India's rapid growth, especially in the context that it does have high debt levels, despite improving revenues on the GST side, and it also has quite a number of states that are still in fiscal trouble, and probably some getting into deeper fiscal trouble. So given this picture, question is, how can, what do you see, how does India sustain growth in these two? And on the China question is, you pointed out, the deteriorating market sentiment for real estate conditions, etc., disinflation, portfolio FDI outflows, but then the PMI is ticking up. So what explains this divergence between the two, and what does the ticking up PMI tell us in the context of all this other bad news?
So on India, you're absolutely right, Srini, that it has been capex led. They have made a concerted effort to boost infrastructure spending, to improve rails, road, whatever you talk about, airports, and so on and so forth. And, along with the effort made on DPI, which is digital public infrastructure gaps have somewhat closed in India. I won't say it's close. The private investment, it's not been growing. It's growing at a much slower pace than what we would need, and a significantly slower pace than what India needs to have the kind of potential growth of 6.5 and above for the medium term. And you're absolutely right that one is bank balance sheets have been cleaned up and corporates are deleveraged. So in some sense, if there is, we would expect more crowding in of private investment. One would hope that post-elections, when there is greater uncertainty, but greater certainty for the next 5 years, you would see investment picking up. But the question, of course, is why hasn't it picked up? I think most recently you've seen some pickup. I think the last 2, 3, 4 months it's been picking up, and one would hope that it would rise. Now on China PMIs, again, as I said, there have been some good numbers. PMIs have been picking up, but if you look at the real estate activity, it's been pretty dismal. So the team is going there next month, looking at this whole thing holistically to see what it all means. PMIs could have been sluggish for some time, and now you've seen some uptick. That could also mean that they are producing more to cater to external demand. It could be anything. But the fact is, it has gone up in expansionary territory, which is good news. So it's a mixed picture. So I won't say anything. I'd say just based on Q1 GDP, one would think there's upside risk. But the information we've gotten so far is pretty mixed. Sarah?
Just,
yeah.
Yeah, I'm an economist at the EAI. So I apologize, my comments is so Chinese, which we have done quite some work. So my first sort of a question is, looking at China, as you mentioned, China and India has been a very significant contributor to whether this region is doing well or not. So on China, sort of a lot of us have still have quite a bit of a confidence for a medium term, and then immediately we have a lot of concerns. So the question is, how do we reconcile this short-term problems and concerns and worries to a medium-term somewhat confidence? So that's the sort of my own puzzle. Second, on the consumption, and we have put in a lot of hope into real estate. But for the real estate sector, several of us, my colleagues and I, we have done some work, and it seems to be that the government at this point, is still quite persistent in the sense that they want to save or salvage some of the project, but not the property developers. So in terms of the support, they're very cautious to say, okay, this project maybe is worth saving, but in general, they're not targeting sort of the developers. We're not going to help the developers because they have done things quite recklessly. So in that sense, the help for this sector and how much they can come back, we think it's very much probably a soft landing of sort, but not a rebound or recovery to the previous. So in that sense, the confidence in the consumption, it's quite hard to see where we are looking at, because employment is not that great, and then the industry is in, there are good things and bad things. So that's the question. And one of the reasons, or one of the things about the local, related to the local government, our colleague, Professor Wang, has recently also looking at the public finance aspect, is that the government has quite limited capacity to come in and save. Because her argument is that the public, the debt is actually much higher than the so-called 10%, if you combine all the other aspects. So the government do not have capacity to come in strongly to support. And that's also related to my earlier question, how do we get out of the short-term worries into a much longer-term confidence? So that's my second. The last question is about industrial policy. Where do you see China's central government's policy on sort of what industries, they're going to high quality, whatever that is, in that area? How does that mean for the production capacity when we talk about the overcapacity? How does that mean for the region, for China's export, for China's domestic economy, and for the region? That's my third. Sorry for that.
So maybe what we could do is kind of collect questions, but since you had three questions, maybe we'll answer them first, and then the next round maybe we'll have three person go on. But please.
So your short term versus long term. In my view, and Thomas can come in here. I think in the short term you have to address the problems in the property sector, which I think will help restore confidence and help also raise domestic demand. They are not trying to go back to the levels they were before. So it's clear that they felt that this was a sector in which there was a lot of leverage. They had to bring it down to more sustainable levels. So the adjustment is ongoing. But to the extent that that problem remains unaddressed, I think it's a real headwind. Linked to that is the fact that if you're a Chinese citizen and you've put a lot of your savings and wealth into housing, and if that is being seen as under duress, it's not going to help if you don't address the problem. So I think that goes back to the issue of confidence. Why is it so linked? I think if you're able to get some semblance of confidence in people's confidence in the housing market, I think that would help boost demand. Going towards the medium term, our medium term growth projection for China is 3.5% in 2028. And that's linked to or driven largely by falling productivity and an aging population. And we've been quite clear that if the government puts in place reforms to address these two issues, productivity and aging, you could have a 1 percentage point higher growth than what we're projecting right now. So instead of 3.5%, it would be 4.5%, right? So that's the thing. So there is the short term and the medium term. There are problems both in the short term, which have to be addressed. I think the property sector related to that is the local government debt issue. And over the medium term, it is the issue I talked about of productivity and aging. You want to come on industrial policy, or you want to add more to that, Thomas?
On property, just briefly, I think in our view, it makes sense to distinguish between the pre-sold but not completed property and the developers to de-link this and try to see the projects, whether they're viable and non-viable, and restructure the projects and sort of take that apart from the developers, partly on confidence. I think And the other part, what maybe is to say, and I think the government has over time also ramped up policies to give a perspective for the sector where it's going in the medium term. It has started various measures trying to finish viable incomplete property sectors. The so-called whitelist for financing these projects has been extended over time and will be extended further. And otherwise, I think it's just what Krishna said. It has been a short-term shock, or has been a large shock in the shock, and much will also depend on the macroeconomic policy response. And I think there is scope to do more, and it's also, besides just traditional macro policies, fiscal policy support, monetary policy easing, there's also some role for debt restructuring in the system at the level of local government and in property sector.
And we do agree that there is not much by way of fiscal space. It's limited fiscal space. But within that, I feel that you could prioritize what is needed to get domestic demand back, both in the short term and in a more durable basis.
And on fiscal space, I think, the old argument that applies. I mean, fiscal space is not given. In a sense, it's limited. China has some relatively high debt level, but it also has relatively low revenue. It has a tax structure that can be made more productive and give larger revenues. So how much fiscal space China has is also partly a choice of the current structure. On industrial policy, I think there are industrial policies at various levels of government. Some of them are easily measurable. Others are more difficult to measure in terms of government supply. So at the central government level, there's different levels of direct government support. One is central government support for innovation. I think the other is guided and to some extent subsidized lending, and including access to PBOC facilities. I think for industrial policy, our general line is there can be a role for industrial policy, in particular if there are market failures. You address them. And if you address market failures, it's also an issue of trade-offs. Sort of weighing market failure versus government failure, and weighing other consideration, including scale and prudence. And I think probably we would argue it's the combination of other factoring, possibly fostering misallocation of capital, in particular also soft budget constraints for hybrid and state-owned entities, guided finance with a view to political priority as opposed to return on capital. And then finally, another considerations are also negative spillovers to trading partners. So overall, in the last staff report, we have argued that China should scale back its industrial policies, both for its own benefits, in a sense of reducing misallocation of capital, and also for the benefit of trading partners.
Thank you. We'll take maybe 3 questions. We'll start there.
Can't hear you.
Thank you, Dr. Krishna. My name is Divya Murali. I'm a research associate from the Institute of South Asian Studies. It's also another institute from the IMF. I work in the trade and economics vertical there. So I have 2 questions. One is, what is your reading on the South Asian growth story? I noticed Bangladesh and India's growth projections, then Bangladesh seems to have a better projection than India's, but you also mentioned Sri Lanka. It seems to be a mixed bag for South Asia. You had 3 other countries contributed, actually reached out to the fund to seek assistance. So in the context, what do you think is the South Asian story? Also, to consider that some of the risks that you mentioned, in for instance, the demography, you could say that South Asia is one of the youngest regions probably. So how is the larger reading for Asia and Pacific translate to the South Asian study. The second one is regarding the suggestion that monetary policy be carried out with respect. I have a differentiated monetary policy and base it on domestic needs. So since 2020, ever since COVID set in, most of the shocks, for instance, the energy shock or food security shock, these are all externalities, and these have had impacts in the inflation for nations here. So how feasible is this suggestion for economies in that? Thanks.
I think we'll just add
So actually, I have a question about the private consumption. I'm Liao from EAI. So in your presentation that for most economies, the private consumption is the major driver, right, for the growth. So I wonder, as now we are in a world with more uncertainty and more conflict, and also high interest rate, and also the income is not that, growth not that fast. So I wonder why the consumption, in addition to China, for ASEAN country, most of the ASEAN country also is the major driver. I wonder why, yeah.
I think the next one is online, so why don't we go ahead?
So I didn't hear a question fully on South Asia. Let me just try answering based on what I heard. Okay. So on Sri Lanka, just both Sri Lanka and Bangladesh have IMF supported programs. Let me be very clear. These are programs which are being supported by the IMF. In the case of Sri Lanka, what we've seen is the program is yielding good results. You see that the growth came out much better than we projected. It's still very, very slow. It came out much better than we had expected. Inflation coming down quite sharply from 70% to around 1%. You see reserves are rising. So Sri Lanka, you're seeing some green shoots. The lesson, the message there is keep up with the reforms to have a more durable recovery. In the case of Bangladesh, what you've seen is it's dealt with back-to-back shocks, starting with the pandemic and then the war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis, and so on. What we've seen so far is they have put in place, they've modernized the monetary policy frameworks. They have embarked on fiscal consolidation based on getting more revenue. The issue in Bangladesh right now is they've had a problem with the capital account. So the current account was doing fine. The capital account is what under stress. And there it's related to having greater exchange rate flexibility. So that's something which is, it's a thing which they're working on. Hopefully, if they address that, then you will see a more normalization of the financial account, and that should also help with the overall BOP. But growth again, it shrank quite a bit, and now it's coming up. And I don't know, I don't have my numbers with me, but it's pretty good, about more than 5% growth in Bangladesh. And your question in India was what exactly?
I was just wondering, what is the overall growth story emerging from South Asia? Even you have the mixed bag of a couple of high growth economies and economies that are actually reaching out to the fund for assistance growth.
So again, it is not a story. There's heterogeneity there. So in India, it's clearly the fastest growing major economy. And again, I answered Srinivasan's question in terms of what I see is needed in terms of getting private investment going and so on and so forth. The other two countries have fund supported programs. It's important for them to stick with the reforms to get more durable recovery. So far, the results have been pretty good. They have stuck to their programs. They've had the reviews for them. On demographics, yes, in India, it's a young population. India is adding 15 million people every year to the labor force. The question, of course, is for this labor force to be more productively contributing to the economy, you have to make sure that they have the right skills. So that's why we've been emphasizing on the need for greater investment in education and health, so that this population, you can actually get the dividend from the favorable demographic. Otherwise, just having population growing or younger population won't make much of a difference if they can't contribute thing. And the question, of course, is do they have the right skills? That's why it's important to invest in education and so on, and this we've heard from many people. So that answers the question, right? That was all.
Last one was on the feasibility of the position on monetary policy.
Yeah. So on monetary policy, what we are saying is in the countries where inflation is coming down, and that actually goes back to your question also. I think part of the reason why you're seeing a contribution from consumption is inflation is coming down. So in some sense, real incomes have gone up, and that's helping to boost consumption in many of these countries. The point I was making on monetary policy is that where inflation is coming down, yeah, right? And one would arguably say that at some point down the road, there's room to ease. If they hook their monetary policy too much to what the Fed does and not focus on what's happening domestically on inflation, you could be either behind the curve or ahead of the curve, and that's what you want to avoid. And you want to see, yes, the interest rate differential will put pressure on exchange rate, allow the exchange rate to be the buffer against shocks, and look at what the fundamentals are in your country. Look at what's happening in the domestic conditions, how they're influencing inflation, and base your monetary policy on that. And don't be overly linked to what the Fed does. That's the point I would make.
Thank you. I think now we go to the online downtown.
All right, thank you. There are two questions online. First from Professor Bert Hoffman, our institute's former director. The question is that there has been a lot of debate on overcapacity in China and allegations it exposes its problems. US and EU officials are threatening to impose renewed tariffs. How does the IMF analyze the overcapacity, and what do you recommend the authorities to do? Here's the first question. The second one is a short one from SC. What are some productivity initiatives that China can embark on? Thank you.
Thomas can answer both those questions together.
So on overcapacity, one general point and then three specific points. The general point is just that overcapacity per se is not very helpful. I think one really has to look at underlying reasons, if anything. In terms of overcapacity, we would distinguish between the macro dimension, and it comes back to the first question on China. It's an economy that experienced a large shock, the real estate correction. So there is excess capacity in the sense the economy has a negative output gap. The key point is adequate macroeconomic policy support, supporting the domestic demand, in particular, as opposed to focusing solely on trying to support the economy through expanding supply. I think that's the first point. The second point, there is also a sectoral dimension to the real estate correction, just because it's essentially a large sectoral shock. While part of the overcapacity or the slack in the economy in construction is in a non-tradable, the downstream industry, some of that is tradable. So there is excess capacity, and there's the sectoral dimension that you have excess capacity. And part of the adjustment process is trying to switch expenditure towards external demand, and that's what we see there. In addition to the general macro policy advice there, I think the advice there is to let the insolvency mechanisms play out. If a firm is insolvent in the sector because of the correction, given the long-term prospects for the sector, which is for lower demand for incremental residential real estate relative to levels seen for the pandemic, then let some of the corporates go bust and let the insolvency regime take its course. And then third is overcapacity related to industrial policy and sort of other factors favoring misallocation. And there I will come back to the policy recommendations mentioned earlier on industrial policy.
What are your recommendations to the American and the European governments, because that is what the first question was about. What would you recommend at the other side of the equation?
Even to the other countries?
Yeah.
So there, I think, these are, if there are multilateral trading issues, then let's deal with these issues in the multilateral trading system rather than in an ad hoc way.
I mean, the point here is there are IP industrial policies used by most countries now. I showed you a chart about where in Asia you have both the advanced economies and emerging economies. I think Asia is the only region where you have everybody doing industrial policy, whereas in the rest of the world, it's the industrial policy which is doing more of it. The advanced economy is doing more of IP, right? And so what we are trying to do in our analysis is to give more even-handed advice in terms of how these policies would be distortionary, right? If there is a market imposition, which Thomas talked about, then you try to address it. It might be beneficial. But when there's no obvious distortion, what are you trying to achieve with industrial policy? And that's where we have to use the multilateral frameworks to bring people together. At the end of the day, it's all some way or the other, it's linking to fragmentation. And the point we've made of all the work we've done on fragmentation is that everybody hurts. So in fact, even in the case of China, we're trying to make the point that the whole issue of excess capacity in IP, it may actually not benefit China over the long run, because if others retaliate by doing something in response, everybody suffers. And in fact, the work we have done on friendshoring and reshoring last October goes into that issue. That at the end of the day, these kind of policies risk increasing fragmentation, which at the end makes everybody worse off.
Dr. Yu Hong online.
Hi, this is Yu Hong with the East Asian Institute. Thank you so much for your presentation. I got questions on the population aging in China. In your presentation, right, you mentioned about the large economies like China. They have to tackle this challenge immediately. That's very important. There actually has been a lot of debate on the population aging issue in China. So taking into account another related issue of shrinking population in China. So what do you recommend the Chinese authority to do on this? Thank you.
On population aging, we have talked about some of the reforms which have been long pending in terms of entitlement reform, making labor markets more flexible and productive, having greater participation of women in the labor force. These are recommendations which we've been making for countries, including China. And I think that's what we have said also in the China Article 4 to address the aging. So in fact, what we do analysis is that if the medium-term growth in China is 3.5%, right? It's largely because of population aging and productivity declining. And there we say that if they do reforms on both productivity and population aging, you could have 1 percentage point higher. I think there was previous question on what should China do in terms of productivity. I think there we've talked about the fact that they need a lot of reforms of SOEs. They have to have competitive neutrality between SOEs and the private sector, and investing in skills. These are reforms you need to boost productivity. You add to that the reforms you need to address aging. If those reforms are done, you can get a significant dividend from that. That's what we've argued.
We have one and then one follow-up. Yeah, so 2 more questions, then we have to come to an end.
I can probably just, hi, thank you very much. I just have one question going back to the comments and questions that were made about local government debts in China. And this issue has really been around for quite a long time, over a decade. And it's been done sort of in a piecemeal fashion. I guess originally there's an audit, some debts migrated to the explicit sovereign balance sheet. There was some legislation put in place, not necessarily completely followed through, but it's gone through sort of fits and starts. And I guess my question is what the IMF's recommendation is for how to resolve this issue. Is this gradualistic sort of cautious approach where over time the central government basically issues debts on behalf of local governments? Is that the preferred policy approach? Or is a more expedited, sort of more forceful resolution, near-term resolution, more appropriate to restore imbalances in the broader fiscal accounts? What are your baseline recommendations for this?
Sorry, one more question on India, and then since we have the time. In the past, India's experience has been anytime 7% or so GDP has been exceeded for 2 or 3 quarters in a row, pressures have picked up, largely due to supply side constraints. Does the fund believe now that after investments in infrastructure that have been made over the last 5-7 years, that those have been eased enough that now India can sustain close to a 7% growth rate without kicking in inflation for a considerable period? So stay the world's fastest growing economy for some time without having huge inflationary pressures.
It sort of like seems, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that the discussions were mostly on China and India. So, of course, we have the right people here.
So on India, I would say that, yes, they have done a lot to close infrastructure gaps, but I'm not sure that's sufficient to say that you will not have the kind of inflation risk. So there are, even now, I said inflation is coming down, it's at 4.7%, but there are upside risks to inflation in India. So it's not that India has found the magic way to say, I'll go at 7-8%, I'll close infrastructure gaps. India is subject to these supply side shocks, whether it's in the agriculture thing or because of higher oil prices coming from, skirmishes outside, it's still there. So it's not gone away. On China, I think I have an answer, but Thomas will be the expert on this.
So you're going to give the 2-second answer of how China is going to solve the local government debt issue in the medium term. You need a major reform that requires quite a bit of political capital. So, I think maybe we can finalize with a lot of work to be done, but we were very appreciative for you to come to NUS and EAI for the presentation on the regional economic outlook. We're looking forward to you coming and visiting us. And we could potentially also from our side and from some of our staff that deal with economic and other issues, maybe even look at whether there are particular areas where we can collaborate and kind of jointly work. Because I think one of the advantage that we have here in Singapore is we're very close to China, maybe a little bit closer than in Washington, D.C. And I don't mean that geographically, just because of the fact that we have probably access to data and information that might be a little bit harder to get when you're in the United States. But with that, first of all, thank you to you, Thomas, Natalia, for organizing this, for you to ask interesting questions, and then of course for all those who have been online, fantastic, and we're looking forward to continued great collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you.